Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, et bonjour à tous et à toutes. My name is Stuart Beck. I'm President and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you today to the launch of our annual Investment Monitor Report and our first full-scale analysis of the impact of COVID-19 on the Canada-Asia Pacific investment relationship. First, I recognize that many of you are joining us from across multiple time zones in both Canada and Asia. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the places Canadians call home are the traditional territories of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. APF Canada is headquartered, and I myself am speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We are grateful to Canada's Indigenous peoples for their stewardship of the lands on which we live, work, and play, and we at APF Canada are collectively committed to the process of reconciliation. It's hard to believe it's been over a year that we are meeting here again in virtual space to launch our annual Investment Monitor Report. There are many challenges ahead as we tackle globally this third wave and no doubt a difficult recovery as we come out the other side of this public health crisis. I hope you find today's presentation helpful. Before I turn over the floor to Dr. Jeff Reeves, APF Canada's Vice President of Research, and our Business Asia Research team, let me go over a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is currently being recorded and will be available on our website shortly. We encourage your questions and comments. Please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to submit your question. If we don't have a chance to answer your questions live, please feel free to reach out to us offline. And for technical support, please reach out to Mandy at events@asiapacific.ca. Now let me hand over the floor to Jeff to introduce our team and APF Canada's Investment Monitor.
Thank you, Stuart. Good morning and good afternoon to all of our participants. My name is Jeff Reeves, and I'm the Vice President for Research at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Now, it's really my pleasure to help with the launch of this year's Investment Monitor, which, as many of you will already know, is one of our foundation's flagship annual reports. Now, I've had the pleasure to be involved with the last 3 report launches, but I think this year's report is different, both in terms of its focus and breadth, which I'll leave it to the Business Asia team to outline in their summary report findings, but also with respect to the broader context in which it was produced. Now, as we're all painfully aware, the past 13 months or so have been a tremendously difficult time, not only for Canada, but for Canadians. I can think back 1 year ago and my children were already 1 month into distance education, and we at the foundation were anxiously wondering what the pandemic might mean for our work. At that time, we came together as a research team and brainstormed about the ways that we could ensure our work added value at a time of national emergency and how we could best fulfill our mandate, which is to look through the lens of Asia to identify areas of opportunity and education for Canada. On the public health front, we decided to focus on pandemic responses and policies in Asia, knowing we all stood to learn from Asia's experiences. On the technology front, we similarly looked at how Asian states use different applications to address and to manage the pandemic. And on the broader strategic front, we focused on how states in Asia were working together through regional institutions so as to provide more clarity of focus for Ottawa towards its regional multilateral engagement. All of these research efforts required a redirection of our research planning and our staffing. I'm pleased to say that this redirection paid off as it led to broader work for the Foundation with the Public Health Agency of Canada that is ongoing and hopefully will contribute in some small way to post-pandemic planning and future pandemic resilience. Now, on the economic side of things, however, we decided to continue with our focus on multi-directional investment because we found our efforts through the Investment Monitor already achieved what we needed it to achieve. Specifically, the Investment Monitor, among other values added, tells the most comprehensive story we know of around when, where, how, and why Canadians are working in Asia and how Asian firms are operating in Canada. The report enables Canadian firms of all sizes to understand the operational terrain in Asia in ways that empower them to make informed decisions and to advance their own, as well as the country's, interests in the region. Now, at a time of great uncertainty, we determined, rightfully, I believe, that we couldn't improve on the investment monitor, that we'd already settled on a framework for analysis that was needed and that could help with our economic planning and ultimately recovery efforts. Our team, as a result, undertook the research with the spirit of contributing not only to a national conversation on investment in Canada, but also with the spirit of helping Canada navigate through a time of great uncertainty and risk. And it's with that spirit that I hope that you'll all view this product today. Now, before turning it over to Pauline Stern and her business development team, who are the principal authors behind this report, I want to congratulate them on a job well done during an exceedingly difficult time. Now, as with everybody on this call, I can only assume that each member of the business development team has almost certainly faced deeply personal challenges, the result of this pandemic. Yet they stayed focused on their tasks at hand and delivered this important and timely report. In my opinion, that is the very definition of professionalism, and I can't say how pleased I am to have them all on my team. Now, enough from me. I'd like to turn the floor over to Pauline Stern, the program manager for our Business Asia Research Pillar, who can introduce the rest of her team and get us started with looking at this year's investment monitor. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Every year brings something exciting and new to analyze in the Canada-Asia investment relationship. In 2020, we witnessed the precipitous fall of Asia-based investment into Canada, and at the very end of the year, some initial glimmers of resurgence. I want to take a moment to thank all the municipal, provincial, and federal investment promotion and economic development agencies across Canada who have worked tirelessly to keep engagement high throughout a very challenging time. We've had the pleasure to speak with many of you over the past 3 weeks, and you shared with us your on-the-ground experience of what has happened to FDI from Asia into Canada over the past 12 months, as well as your agency's strategies for attracting investment from Asia in the coming year. The knowledge you shared with us is deeply valuable to our research, and hopefully, with all of us collaborating together, we can help contribute to a resilient recovery for Canada, one that positions Canada well in developing deep, high-quality investment ties with investors across the Asia Pacific. And with that, I'm pleased to hand things over to Isaac for our annual report presentation.
First of all, thank you everyone for taking your time from your busy schedule to join this webinar. And I hope everyone's staying safe in the midst of this current third wave. As the Investment Monitor project has entered into the 5th year of its iteration, we continue to strive to inform policymakers, investment attraction agencies, as well as the general public on this very important facet of Canada's economic relations with the Asia Pacific. I think this discussion is particularly timely as we start thinking about economic recovery from the pandemic. As some in the audience may recall, every year we have a special theme to our report. Last year, we examined the relationship between FDI and free trade agreement. The theme of this year's report is on investment opportunities and challenges for Canadian companies in the Asia Pacific post-COVID environment, with a special focus in digital, clean energy, and R&D engaged sectors. For today's agenda, I will first do a quick introduction about the Investment Monitor and our methodology. Then I'll go on to talk about Asia Pacific economic recovery plans and the challenges and opportunities it may bring for Canadian investors. Having done so, we'll go back and take stock of what happened in the past 18 years for inbound investments from the region, as well as Canadian investments in the Asia Pacific. Now, this presentation will take approximately 35 minutes, and we'll conclude with about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. So save your questions to the end. Before I launch into my presentation, I just want to make a quick shout out to our partner, University of Calgary, School of Public Policy, and our sponsors, Invest in Canada, Export Development Canada, and the Government of British Columbia. Without their support, the Investment Monitor project wouldn't have grown to the scale as we have today. And I would also like to, echoing Pauline's sentiment earlier, thank all the investment attraction agencies and the members of business communities which have taken the time to speak with us during the course of this research. As we continue to strengthen Canada's investment relations with the Asia-Pacific region, your on-the-ground expertise is very much needed for us to contextualize what we're seeing in the data. Just a quick recap on the Investment Monitor for those in the audience who might not be as familiar with the project. The Investment Monitor was started in 2016 as a tool to complement official foreign direct investment statistics compiled by StatsCan. While StatsCan's data provide really good high-level overview of Canada's investment relations with other partner economies, for very good reasons such as privacy, their data do not disclose who was making these investments and what are they investing. Now, furthermore, as much as we love investors from Bermuda, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands, we know a lot of these investments do not originate there. With a bottom-up methodology, the Investment Monitor tracks these investment flows at a transactional level. Now, this allows us to trace transactions to the ultimate parental company and disaggregate data down to the municipal level. In the project, we track Canada's bilateral investment flow with 28 economies in the region. This includes South Asian economies such as India and Nepal, East Asian economies like China and Japan, and all the way to Oceania like Australia and New Zealand. We also use an open source methodology when tracking these investment deals. Some of the sources we use include APF Canada's unique legacy data, corporate press releases, media reports, and investment promotion agencies' announcement. Our data tracks investment deals by 28 variables from ownership type to method of entry to sectors of investment. And most recently, we have also started cataloging inbound FDI deals by rural and urban locales to better understand the nature of Asia-Pacific economic footprint here at home. And tracking these variables allow us to answer some of the key policy and business intelligence questions, such as who is investing in what and by how much. Now, to date, the Investment Monitor project has cataloged 3,826 bilateral investment deals with a combined value of 447 billion Canadian dollars of investment. As mentioned earlier, this report focuses on the opportunities and challenges for Canada's investment relations with the region in the post-COVID world. While COVID-19 pandemic has been devastating to our economy with the vaccine rollout, it is really important to start thinking about the recovery strategy now. Now, in the Canadian policy space, plenty of government agencies have started to do so. For example, in a recent report by Industry Strategy Council of Canada, a private sector advisory council to ISED, has outlined a vision for Canada's post-COVID economic recovery. And the report specifically called for a digital, sustainable, and innovation economy. Now, in this spirit, the Investment Monitor this year looked at how the region thinks about COVID recovery and the opportunities it may bring to Canadian companies in the digital, clean energy, and R&D space. And we specifically looked into recovery strategies of 4 economies, including South Korea, India, Singapore, and Australia. These economies were selected not just because they have an overlapping vision with the Canadian recovery strategy, but we also took consideration of the government's trade diversification objective and try to explore investment destinations beyond the largest markets, such as China and Japan. And certainly our market selection is also constrained by the availability of data at the time of writing. Across the 4 economies that we have examined, these governments have all incorporated spending programs to boost their competitiveness in the digital, clean energy, and R&D engaged sectors in the post-COVID environment. Here's just a list of examples. In South Korea, the government announced a recovery strategy named the Korean New Deal last year, July. On the digital front, the Korean government is planning to enhance the integration of data, network, and artificial intelligence across the economy. Now, to achieve this, the Korean New Deal includes a 7.2 billion Canadian dollar initiative to build a data dam to enable collection, disclosure, utilization of data throughout the economy. South Korea's push towards digitalization across the economy is also echoed in Australia, where its government is pushing out a digital business plan and earmarking $764 million of investment to accelerate digital transformation in Australian businesses. In India, the digitalization effort is more focused on the fintech sector specifically, as the government allocates $259 million of investment to promote digital payments across the economy. In Singapore, the government is pushing out an emerging technology program where it pledged to co-fund trials and adoption of digital technologies such as 5G and artificial intelligence. Similarly, for the 4 economies that have also made renewable infrastructure a priority in their recovery plan. For instance, in South Korea, the government is pledging investments to support 200,000 households to install renewable energy equipment. In Australia, the government is investing $47 million towards its carbon capture, use and storage development fund, which will provide grant funding to pilot projects aimed at reducing emission. Hydrogen technologies seems to be a consistent theme in some of the economies that we have examined as well. For instance, where South Korea and Indian government have allocated substantial funding to support the development of hydrogen technologies, and the Australian government has planned on allocating 67 million Canadian dollars of investment towards its hydrogen export hub. And lastly, the 4 economies we analyzed also budgeted spending programs to improve their innovation capacity. In South Korea, these R&D programs are much more directly targeted at specific technologies, such as big data-enabled delivery systems, while Singapore is much more focusing on developing partnerships across its innovation ecosystem, such as partnering problem owners to solvers. Now, Canadian companies have long established a foothold in these economies. With these respective with the government's latest recovery plans, we think this could bring more investment opportunities for Canadian companies in the coming years. With that being said, let's have a quick look at Canada's current investment relations with these economies so far. As you can see in the bar charts, the investment flow are cataloged into 2 types: non-R&D related in dark blue and R&D related investments in light blue. It should be noted that the figures listed here in light blue bars do not indicate how much these Canadian companies have spent in their R&D budget in the respective destination economies. Rather, we have examined how much investment flow can be associated with an R&D motive. In other words, are these companies establishing a research unit in the host economy as part of their investments? Or for the cases for mergers and acquisition, are these companies buying any R&D intensive companies abroad? Among the economies that we have analyzed, Australia saw the most relevant sectors for Canadian investments. From 2003 to 2020, Canadian companies have invested more than 3.6 billion Canadian dollars in the Australia's digital industry, of which 222 is associated with R&D. In the Australian clean energy industry, we saw $2.4 billion of Canadian investments, and we have also identified 573 million worth of investments, which are R&D related in other sectors. India at the top right corner came in second, while Singapore at third, and South Korea at last. Interestingly, South Korea, it is really interesting for the research team when we were looking at this. South Korea, while very well known for its high-tech sectors, saw the least amount of R&D associated Canadian investment in the economy, with only $21 million of investment in its digital industry. With that being said, there are also headwinds for Canadian investors hoping to take advantage of these initiatives. Now, some of these common challenges include prioritization of domestic companies in their recovery strategies. For example, in India, there's a push towards greater self-reliance in manufacturing capabilities. This self-reliance agenda has led the government to impose higher tariff on solar sales and modules. This may deter any markets access-driven Canadian investment in the India clean energy industry. Another common challenge is that some of the economies that we looked into have imposed a more stringent foreign investment screening mechanisms. For instance, in Australia, the Parliament passed an amendment to Foreign Acquisition and Takeover Act in January, and the amendment requires foreign investors to seek approval for all investments in land or businesses that is sensitive to national security, regardless of value. However, despite of these challenges, there remains high potential for Canada to collaborate with these economies to elevate their existing investment relations in the post-COVID environment. Therefore, it is really important for the Canadian government start engaging respective partner economies to tackle these challenges early on and to realize the full potential of these investment relationships. As part of our effort looking into the outbound R&D investments, we have also conducted a search of inbound R&D related investments. These inbound R&D investments could also offer interesting insights around Canada's investment synergy vis-a-vis its outbound partners. Like the outbound investment graph that I demonstrated earlier, the same data caveat also applies to this inbound R&D chart, as the figures listed here do not indicate how much the companies from the source economies have spent their R&D budget here in Canada. Rather, this is much more of a story about how much investments can be associated with an R&D motive. Now, in this search, we found Japan to be the largest source economy to be associated with R&D investments, with $2.1 billion of inflow, followed by China at 1.4 billion and South Korea at 708 million. Japan's relatively high R&D investment flow is due to, in part, a high value transaction in 2016, where Sumitomo Chemical acquired a Toronto-based Synopsys Therapeutics for $841 million. In terms of sectoral distribution, we have seen biotech reign as the #1 sector receiving R&D related FDI. And this is perhaps not too surprising for many in the audience, given that the sector is generally quite R&D intensive. This is followed by technology, hardware, and equipment at $1.3 billion, pharmaceutical at $924 million, and software and computer services at $843 million. Let me switch gear a little bit to look at Asia-Pacific investments into Canada in the past years, understanding that you might be curious as to how COVID has impacted Canada's inbound investment flow from the region. The dollar amount shown here are adjusted to 2020 dollar terms. In 2020, we saw a drop of inbound investment on a year-on-year level, from 9 billion in 2019 to 6.4 billion in 2020. This represented a 30% drop in annual flow from the previous year. At the same time, we saw an increase in investment activity from 163 deals to 181 deals last year. While Canada's inbound investment flow from the region did not fare very well, it remained higher than the 2015 level, where Canada only received $5.7 billion of inflow from the region. However, when we look at the overall trend, thanks to the 24 billion of Asia-Pacific investments into LNG Canada in 2018, Canada's inbound flow from the region in the most recent 3-year period have rebounded from the low end in 2015 to 2017, where Canada only saw 27.9 billion of inbound investment. This is in addition to the sharp increase in investment activities from 244 deals to 476 deals. Looking at inbound flow in the past 18 years, China remained the top source economy for Canada from the region with $90.8 billion invested. This is followed by Japan at 38 billion, South Korea at 20 billion. The story behind Chinese investments into Canada can be explained by a series of oil and gas investments which occurred between late 2000s and the early 2010s, whereas Japan is much more about a story of a series of automotive investments into Ontario. Sectorial-wise, Canada still relies on natural resources to drive its inbound investment. As you can see in this tree map, oil and gas remains the dominant sector in the most recent 3-year period with $25 billion of inflow from the region. However, a significant portion of that inbound flow can be attributed to the 24 billion LNG Canada projects taking place in Kitimat. Other than the oil and gas investments, mining came in second with 9.3 billion. As much as we want the Canada's technology sector to succeed, it only currently accounts for a relatively smaller portion of Canada's inbound flow from the region at the bottom right corner. Software and computer services, for instance, saw $2 billion of inflow in the most recent 3-year period. As Canada leans towards its technology industry for its recovery, we think this is really good opportunity to double down our investment attraction efforts in this industry. And on the right, you also see Aerospace and Defense at $984 million of inflow. And this is more so of a story of Mitsubishi's commercial aviation investments in Quebec. As we open up a new decade last year, I think it's also worthy of a quick recap on how ownership and method of entry for inbound Asia-Pacific FDI changes over time. This is because these data can speak more directly to Canadians' concern about foreign investors. For instance, according to our 2019 National Opinion Poll, we have seen that Canadians are much more likely to disapprove of investments from a state-owned enterprise than a private entity in the high-tech sector. While this concern is certainly legitimate in light of our current economic crisis, what we have seen in the past 10 years has been a general decline in the proportion of SOE investments into Canada. This is from 60% earlier in the decade to 40% in the latter half. What we did see more in the past 5-year period is a lot more private companies investing here in Canada, with the latest period accounting for 60% of the inbound investment flow in dollar terms. This is important. It's also very important to note that how some of these high-value investment deals skew our data. For instance, CNOOC's $15 billion acquisition of Nixon Energy in 2013 alone accounted for 24% of Canada's inbound flow from 2011 to 2015, while Asia Pacific state-owned enterprises' stake in the LNG project in Kitimat made up 26% of Canada's inbound investment flow in the second half of the decade. For method of entry, Canadians generally prefer greenfield over M&A investments, as greenfield often translates to more visible economic opportunities like brick and mortar manufacturing plants or a retail store down those streets. And understandably, many are concerned of foreign investors coming in and buying up Canadian companies. If we look at the data in the past 10 years, however, we did see greenfield investments became the dominant mode of entry. In the last 5 years, greenfield accounted for 58% of Canada's inbound flow. Now, this is driven in large part due to the LNG deal, as the $24 billion project alone made up 35% of inbound investment in that period. Now, this picture could very much change in the upcoming years, but the evolving nature of who is investing and how they're investing calls for extra caution when policymakers are allocating their resources to attract or deter a certain types of investments. We should be always cautious of reacting to a narrative that might have been true earlier in the decade, while reality on the ground has shifted. It is really important for us to continue monitoring these trends evolve over time to inform policymaking and investment attraction strategies. I think the investment attraction agencies out here in the West would be a little bit more happy about this slide. At the provincial level, Asia Pacific investments, Canada remained concentrated in the 2 Western provinces, Alberta and British Columbia, as the 2 respectively accounted for 2/3 of Canada's inbound flow in the last 18 years. And they're followed by provinces in Central Canada, Ontario and Quebec, as they respectively accounted for 21% and 6% of inbound investment in dollar value. And together, the 4 most populous provinces accounted for 94% of Canada's inbound from the Asia Pacific region. And since last year, the Investment Monitor have been tracking Asia Pacific investments into rural and urban locales in Canada. We found that Asia Pacific investments in rural communities have sharply increased in the last 3 years. Of the 4 biggest provinces, we found British Columbia saw the biggest proportion of rural investments from the region, as rural communities account for 48% of the province inbound flow. But again, this is in large part due to the $24 billion worth of LNG project in Kitimat. Alberta seems to have the lowest proportion of rural investments in among the 4 most populous provinces, with only 6% of its inbound flow is directed to its rural communities. Now, this seems to be because majority of Alberta's inbound investments have been largely directed at the headquarters of oil and gas companies in Calgary downtown. But we know a lot of these investments will ultimately be funneled to the other locales where their actual oil operations are located. When we're comparing sectoral composition for inbound investment flow from the 3 biggest FDI recipient provinces, oil and gas sectors has accounted for a significant portion of Alberta's inbound investment flow at 83%, while BC's oil and gas accounts for a significant chunk of the province inbound investment. It makes up a lower proportion with only compared to Alberta, with only 52%. BC has also seen Asia Pacific investments going into other natural resources sectors such as industrial metals and mining and general mining. Ontario's inbound investment flow is a little bit more diverse and less natural resources driven, from automotive to general retailers to biotech. When we look at their source economies as well, investments from for the big Asian economies such as China, Japan, and Australia all show up across the 3 provinces. However, their rankings differ from one province to another, where China seems to play much more of a dominant role in Alberta's inbound investment flow at 68% of inbound investment from the province inbound flow. BC and Ontario saw a lower proportion of its FDI from China at 36% and 27% respectively. In comparison, Japan accounts for a bigger chunk of BC and Ontario's inbound investment flow in the last 18 years at 21% and 39% respectively. Its investment into Alberta for the last 18 years made up a lower proportion. One of the things that Investment Monitor did really well is tracking these investments at the establishment level. This detailed level of FDI monitoring allows policymakers to understand the specific locational drivers for some of these investments, especially when we're talking about accessing very specific pools of talents and certain kinds of natural resources. These are often clustered in very specific cities and or regions. And national level statistics wouldn't allow us to parse out those drivers. As you can see on the map, Asia-Pacific investments into Canada has a deep impact on communities across Canada. These are just 10 of the 223 communities that have seen Asia-Pacific investments. Now, some of these locales are large urban centers, such as Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver, while others are much smaller communities, such as Dawson Creek in British Columbia and Fort McMurray in Alberta, which have also seen quite substantial inbound flow. Now, 6 cities in Western Canada have made it to the top 10 list, including Vancouver, Kitimat, Dawson Creek in BC, and Calgary, Fort McMurray, and Duvernay in Alberta. Except for Vancouver, other cities have been here in the West have been much more of an oil and gas driven story. And out to the East, where Toronto and Montreal have seen a more diverse sectors of investments, bulk of its inbound FDI to Cambridge and Woodstock has been driven by its automotive sectors. And across the Pacific Ocean, here's the map of where the biggest Asia-Pacific investors are located in the region. Some of these cities include are names that many of us are familiar, from Beijing to Seoul to Melbourne, others not as much, like Longyan in China and Ulsan in South Korea. For 2020 specifically, Singapore is Canada's biggest source city with more than $2 billion invested. Bulk of the deal flow, however, is driven by Singaporean sovereign fund GIC's acquisition of 4 Fairmont hotels at Whistler in BC and Lake Louise, Banff Spring, and Jasper Park in Alberta. As much as it is really important to examine how much money is coming in, outbound investment flow is also an important piece of the puzzle, as these have significant impact on economic productivity at home and export, among other things. As you may recall from the inbound slide, Canada's inbound flow has plummeted by 30% on a year-on-year basis. Interestingly, we did see an increase of outbound investment flow from in the latest period, from 12 billion in 2019 to 16 billion in the past year. This represented a $3.7 billion of increase in outbound flow from the previous year. Bulk of these investments have been driven by big institutional investors like Brookfield Asset Management and pension funds like Ontario Municipal Employee Retirement System. It is really interesting for the research team to see that many of these investors see opportunities in the Asia-Pacific market despite of the current economic challenges. Despite the year-on-year increase in 2020, when we look at the overall trend, we see a plateau of Canadian investments in the Asia-Pacific region, comparing the most recent 3-year period to the period of 2015 to 2017. But even then, the period of 2018 to 2020 marked the second highest Canadian outbound investments in the region in any time period. Looking at the destination economies for Canadian investments in the past 18 years, while it is really interesting that China is by far Canada's largest source economy of FDI in the region, Australia emerges as Canada's top investment destination in the Asia-Pacific at $75 billion invested. This is followed by China at 46 billion, India at 33 billion. With that being said, Canadian investments in India seems to be picking up pace in the last 3 years, as India surpassed China as the second highest recipient economy for Canadian FDI in the region from 2018 to 2020. When Canadians are investing abroad, the sectors of which they're investing seems to be quite diversified, as Canadian companies have injected capital from sectors in sectors from finance to consumer goods and services to the technology industry in the past 18 years. For example, Canadian companies have invested over 24 billion of capital in the Asia-Pacific real estate and investment services sector, as you can see the dark blue box on the left. Some of these include shopping malls in South Korea and office buildings in Australia. Canadian companies have also been active investors in the region's critical infrastructure assets as well. For example, in the last 18 years, Canada has invested $22 billion of investments in the region's industrial transportation sector. And some of these include toll roads in Indonesia and India. A lot of these outbound investments have been driven by Canadian state-owned enterprises too. As you can see the pie charts on the left, the proportion of Canadian SOE investment into the region has grown significantly in the past 10 years, from 21% in the first half of the decade to 47% in the latter half. Many of these investments have been driven by large pension funds, such as CPPIB, Ontario Municipal Retirement System, as well as the British Columbia Investment Management Corporation. As the region develops, Canadian companies have really shifted away from greenfield investments to M&A as their preferred mode of entry. The proportion of M&A outbound FDI has increased from 46% in the first half of the decade to 70% in the latter half. This map is one of my favorite in the Investment Monitor project, as it, I think, showcase the depth and breadth of Canada's economic engagement in the region. And again, you might be familiar with some of the cities listed here, such as Beijing, Hong Kong, and Sydney. Others are not as well known, perhaps, such as Copenhagen and Bangladesh. This is only 10 of the 496 cities and communities that have seen Canadian investments in the last 18 years. As COVID continued to pose a threat to the world and our own economy, mapping out these investment relationships down to the municipal level is particularly important, I think, as we can see our own economic exposure to the region's public health response at the local level. For instance, if Seoul succeeds in containing the spread of the virus, we might anticipate a smaller impact on the 781 million of Canadian retail investments in the city. While I cannot go over each and individual stories of Canadian outbound FDI per city, if you want to learn more, I would encourage you to read our annual report, which is live on our website at asiapacific.ca. Alternatively, you can take advantage of our data visualization tool by going on investmentmonitor.ca and explore this information-rich data sets by yourself. And to end off my presentation, I just want to conclude with 5 observations. Now, firstly, we have seen a recovery plan, as we have seen in their region's recovery plan, the Asia-Pacific economies are really boosting their competitiveness in the digital, green, and R&D related industries. We think that this trend presents investment opportunities for Canadian companies in the coming years. While inbound FDI from the Asia-Pacific saw a decrease from 2019 to 2020, Canadian investments in the region has remained highly resilient despite of the current economic condition. When we look at the rural and urban divide of inbound FDI, we found that Asia-Pacific investments remain highly concentrated in large urban centers, accounting for 79% of dollar value of that Canada has received from the region in the last 18 years. Fourth, in light of the current economic crisis, many have understandably been concerned about the role of foreign SOE play in the Canadian economy. However, what we have found in the last decade is that proportion of Asia-Pacific SOE investments into Canada has declined. This could very much change in the upcoming years, but we should continue monitoring this trend as it evolves. And lastly, FDI is more than just a number on the national balance of payment account, as it has a visible economic impact in the host communities. In the last 18 years, 223 Canadian cities and communities have received Asia-Pacific investments, while 496 municipalities in the Asia-Pacific region have seen Canadian investments. Now, each of these relationships establish economic and personal ties between the two regions. Thank you everyone again for taking the time from your busy schedule to attend this webinar. I hope you find this session to be fairly informative. And before passing on to the floor for Q&A, I just want to make a quick shout out to my colleagues, Olivia Adams, Charlotte Atkins, and Rachel Tahari, as they have been tirelessly prowling through the data and drafting of the report in the past few months. If you have any questions about my presentation, I would also encourage you to reach out to me as well as any of my teammates. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isaac, for that insightful presentation. Riffing off the last point you made, I readily agree that FDI is more than just a number, and that we really have to shift our thinking to considering the totality of the impact of FDI. especially as it pertains to acting as a critical seed in Canada's burgeoning innovation ecosystems. So with that, I'm excited to open the floor to questions from our audience. Please don't be afraid to dive deep into the knowledge bank of APF Canada. No question is too large to at least attempt to tackle. And if we don't make it to your question, please feel free to connect with us for a follow-on chat. So Isaac, our first question from the audience is, interested in digital economy opportunities for Canada. How does Canada stack up against Asia-Pacific countries? In what ways can Canada invest domestically?
I think in the past 18 years, Canada has really tried to ramp up our digital economy to attract further foreign investments, and this is particularly apparent in some of the emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, as well as an upcoming work that we're working on right now, the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement that Canada is doing public consultation, and I think that this is definitely going to be a trend in the coming years. And as I think the region thinks about, really trying to accelerate the digitalization effort in the region, I think this presents Canadian companies further opportunities to take advantage of these initiatives. And some of these include emerging technologies in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, where Canada has outlined a vision for which Canada can perhaps really take a leadership position, or at least work in collaboration with other partner economies in developing those technologies. And then, in fact, like in the past, some of the interesting findings that we have seen in the past 18 years, or particularly in the last 3 years, is the rapid deal count, or the increase in deal counts, as well as investment value in the software and computer services investments from the Asia Pacific investment into Canada. Now, some of the sort of readily companies that I have remember from the data set that we worked on includes Samsung recent AI investments into Toronto, as well as in Montreal, as well as Fujitsu investments here in Vancouver, as they're trying to set up a global AI HQ down the streets. So I think this is a really exciting opportunity for Canada to really double down its effort for attracting digital investments in Canada's digital industry. And I think with the recent recovery plan, I think the government has made that abundantly clear that digital sector is definitely one of the prioritized sectors.
Wonderful, thank you. A next question that we've got is, can we get any insights into technology transfer into Canada through these investments? So I guess that's a nice kind of follow-up question to that first one that you're asking of, and which was actually a point that I was going to kind of make to that first answer you gave, which is, we've seen this first wave of digital and tech investment into Canada. What have we done to support the continuation of those corporations investing in Canada? And also, what are we seeing this kind of benefits of those initial investments?
Right, and I think it's really important to highlight that point, because while some of these investments initially seems to be quite small in capital investment flow, but these brings really substantial economic impacts to Canada. And this might present technological diffusion in the coming years. And should those companies be successful in some of these investments, there's opportunity for those companies to expand their operations here in Canada. So I think, and again, this points to really points to the opportunity that, in the upcoming years, we should really focus on the digital sectors and have a focus or have a better understanding of how we can facilitate those investments, as well as how those Asia Pacific companies can succeed in Canada.
Mm-hmm. It's about not only just the transfer, but about the compatibility that it creates between Canadian research entities and South Korean research entities, for example.
Right.
That is utterly critical if we want to tap into those 4 markets you identify as prioritizing R&D in their economic recoveries.
Right.
All right, so on to the next question. What sectors were resilient for investment into Canada in 2020? That is, what sectors saw the highest deal flow and deal count in 2020?
It's very interesting for us to actually see that the travel and leisure emerges as one of the top sector for investments. But I think this is, again, due to the high value of investments of GIC, the Singapore Sovereign Fund acquisition of 4 Fairmont hotels here in Canada. But I think the deal was actually struck before the pandemic hit, so there's that. But I think, and again, I would like to come back to this point. What we did see this year in terms of deal count is the rapid, really picking up pace of the software and computer services sector, as we have seen in 2020. I think if I remember correctly, and if any of the team members want to jump in this conversation, it is the software and computer services actually account for 30% of Canada's inbound investment deal count for this year, 2020 specifically.
Did you see any geographic shifts in those investments? And traditionally, if they have been in Vancouver, have you seen them migrate out east or the reverse?
I think traditionally, Western Canada definitely has a lot more Asia Pacific economic or investment footprint, given its natural resources sort of sectors, and recent example of such as the LNG Canada project here in Kitimat. But I think with the more sort of, there's a lot of investment activities happening, also shifting to central Canada. Like, I read the example that I pointed to earlier about Samsung investments into Montreal for its artificial intelligence operations. So I think, this is, I think, an emerging trend, but we should continue monitoring these as it develops.
Great, thank you. Next question is, what is the most important thing Canada needs to do in terms of its COVID-19 economic recovery? Will oil be a part of that recovery, considering the oil crash of 2020?
I think this is a really interesting question. And, oil and gas traditionally has played a really significant role of Asia Pacific investments here in Canada. But I think, at the same time, diversification is really should be the key pillar of Canada's recovery strategy. As we have seen, oil prices come and go, and it could be unstable or it could be unstable factors for attracting Asia Pacific investments here in Canada. So building up those more diverse sectorial basis in attracting Asia Pacific capital would really be the way forward in the upcoming years. And we think that in the digital and clean energy and R&D engaged sectors are really the way for a crucial part of that story.
Great. The next question is one that we thought would come up, which is it says detailed presentation. Thank you. As to the geopolitics, what will be the implications of the March 2021 federal guidelines on the National Security Review of Investments, particularly for potential Chinese investments?
I guess, Pauline, you might be a little bit more well-suited to answer the political side of the story. But I think in terms of Chinese investments here in Canada, what we have seen in the most recent 3-year period remains very much so a natural and, oil and gas story. So there, for instance, the Chinese investments into LNG projects here in Kitimat remains the primary driver for Chinese investments here. But with that being said, the National Security Review, it's really important for us to sort of balance these sort of our own economic interests as well as the political interests. So it would be interesting to continue monitoring these trends and whether that would sort of have an impact on inbound flow into Canada.
So to widen the question slightly, because it's something that we've been anticipating and following incredibly closely for the last 8 months, we watched Australia introduce the Foreign Relations Bill and the impact that that has on not just investment, but any type of R&D international collaboration. The bill that kind of recommendations that were introduced in Canada are strictly to do with investment at the moment. But investment doesn't stand in a siloed isolation. When you're doing an R&D related investment, you're usually having some type of academic collaboration. People choose Montreal because of various academic talents. So it's all kind of wrapped up together. So it will have a substantial impact, not just on direct deal count that we'll see over the next year, but in that larger ecosystem, which is the whole point of nurturing those tech sector investments, is for that wider ecosystem of innovation and technological development. Okay, which one to go to next? last year has hammered home some of the risks to Canadian businesses, both at home and abroad. How some of Canada's most risk-averse actors, pension funds and big funds, managed. Could pension data be a good indicator for future perceived opportunities and risks? Is what CPPIB doing in Asia Pacific today a good kind of harbinger of things to come?
It is really actually very interesting for the Business Asia team when we're looking at this data, and we're really sometimes surprised by some of the moves that the pension funds have made in the region. I think it was a recent deal that CDPQ, actually the Quebec Pension Fund, has invested in renewable infrastructure in Taiwan, and I think it actually demonstrates the they have incorporated ESG as their investment guidelines and trying to sort of use investment as a tool to promote sustainability across the economy, but also demonstrate that there is a business case for those pension funds to do so. So I think yes, and in my opinion, that those pension funds are making move in anticipation of the region's sort of embrace for the digital transformation, as well as the making renewable infrastructure as their priority.
Mm-hmm. And ensuring that Canada is part of that digital transformation hub, our connection with Singapore and the knock-on kind of benefit that it has to not just the FDI investing company from Canada, but the other service companies across Canada. The next question is, although there was a sharp decline in FDI into Canada in 2020 in terms of actual dollar value, perhaps not surprisingly, there appears to be a record deal count in 2020. Is this due to increased activity by Asian SMEs? Is this a trend? And what is the explanation? If this is a trend, how can Canada adjust its Asia strategy?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I do think this is a lot because a lot more Asia Pacific SMEs are investing here in Canada, and it seems to be picked up by some of the sources that we use, the Investment Canada acquisitions. So it's really interesting for us to continue monitoring the rapid acceleration of deal counts, while perhaps the deal flow is not increasing at the same pace as the deal count. But with that being said, if there's more Asia Pacific SMEs investing here in Canada, that also means that there's a much more diverse basis of which those investment relationships are being established. So yeah, we will continue monitoring this trend as it develops.
Mm-hmm. Great. The next question is, in terms of Biotech Inward Fdi, what areas of focus were there? Pharmaceutical and medical, agri-food, forestry? For agri-food, which regional corridors were targeted most? Saskatchewan or Saskatoon, Guelph, Waterloo, Guelph?
For biotech, if I remember correctly, I think, as I mentioned earlier, there's this huge deal that came in 2016 where a Japanese company is acquiring a Toronto-based pharmaceutical company. And that company is more so specialized in Parkinson's disease treatment, if I remember correctly. So it's very interesting for us to look at this as, okay, biotech is quite R&D centric in the first place, but it's also fairly clustered in central Canada, where many of these R&D operations are taking place. Mm-hmm. In terms of agri-food, I don't remember exactly the exact location of where some of these investments are taking place, but an interesting deal that we have seen in the past year is a Thai company acquiring some farming companies here in Canada as they're trying to expand that sector, the sectorial presence here. So we will, if we can, perhaps I can look into this further, post the presentation and send the specific feedback as well as the data.
Great. The next question is, how is Canadian outbound investment changing on a city level? So I assume that means, what different cities in the Asia Pacific region is Canadian investment going into? Are there any new up and coming cities?
Up and coming cities. I think, Toronto and Montreal are definitely some of the up and coming cities in the past 3 years.
The reverse. So in the
sorry. Okay. Oh, actually, it's really also very interesting as I personally worked on this chapter. I think Australian cities have been historically Canada's strongest investment or highest FDI recipient communities. What we have seen in 2020 is actually Mumbai and Bengaluru taking over some of these Australian cities and emerge as Canada's top investment destination. And I think this really represents, the really strong economic opportunities in the upcoming years as India look towards its sort of digitalization effort.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, so we'll do a big one. How do Canada's R&D, clean energy, and digital related investments compare to those of selected Asia-Pacific economies?
I think this is a fairly difficult question, and obviously there is no apple-to-apple comparison. But what we did see more is that there's a huge overlap of Canada's economic recovery vision with the partner economies in the Asia Pacific. So as I pointed out, hydrogen seems to be a consistent theme in South Korea, in India, and Australia. And even hydrogen technologies are being highlighted in our most recent federal budget as a potential sort of sectors that we should really foster, right? And I think this sort of overlapping of the visions really provide Canada to sort of elevate those existing investment relationships.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'll turn things over now back to our Vice President of Research for some concluding remarks.
Pauline and Isaac, I'd like to just congratulate you and your team on putting together what is such a comprehensive and insightful look into multi-directional investment from Canada into Asia and Asia back into Canada. I think we could have continued this discussion much longer if we'd had a little bit more time on the clock. I know that we had great amount of interest from the participants. Thank you again to the participants who took time out of their busy schedules to come and hear our summary findings from this report. For those that are interested, please do follow up with the foundation, either directly with Pauline or Isaac or with any other member of the Business Asia team to get more insight into some of the discussions that we had here today. The investment monitor will also be made available through our website and through other means. So please do look for that final publication as it does come out. For those that are interested in following more broadly what the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada is doing, I would recommend signing up to our Asia Watch weekly publication series that we send out now twice a week. We do highlight a lot of these investment trends on a more kind of tactical daily basis, but we also look at other things that happen in the region with respect to environmental issues, broader economic trends, security trends, and development issues that we track on a daily basis as well. So thank you again for your participation, and thank you, Isaac, in particular, for an excellent presentation and question and answer period. I'm glad that we got to cover as much data as that we did, and we look forward to continuing this discussion with participants offline. Thank you very much again, and thank you from the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada.